counter-violent extremism or preventing violent extremism, CVE or PVE for short. These policies single out Muslims when they are applied on a national level. And this event is the Middle East panel and is the third of a series as we track the spread of counter-violent extremism legislation and its subsequent impact on Muslims around the world. A case in point would be UN Security Council Resolution 2178, which binds nations to CVE and PVE policies. As a community, we need to realize that we must be alert to the spread of these policies in other countries because they will end up on our own doorsteps. But we as Muslims should also take heart too. If we can defeat such legislation in our own country, not only have we stopped it here, but we can help other Muslims tackle it elsewhere. If you want to see more of these kinds of events, join our team as a volunteer. There will be a link in the chat. Professor David Miller is a co-founder of the non-profit company Public Interest Investigations, which runs two key projects, spinwatch.org and a research database, Powerbase.info, which focuses on the networks of powerful individuals and institutions shaping the public agenda. He is also the producer and regular commentator on Press TV's Palestine Declassified. Professor David Miller himself has been Professor of Sociology in the University of Strathclyde and the University of Bath, and Professor of Political Sociology at the University of Bristol. He has written in and been broadcasted across a range of news outlets, giving his expert opinion on matters of lobbying, counter-terrorism, and Islamophobia. He will give us an overview of the spread of counter-extremism policies in the UAE and Saudi Arabia in particular, and the Middle East in general. It's a great pleasure to have him with us here tonight. Please, Professor, do go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm going to make some comments on counter-extremism, yes, and the Middle East or West Asia, depending on how we describe it. And I suppose that in the current circumstances where the whole question of the unipolarity of the world appears now to be in question for very, very many people, I think we might be rethinking the whole term Middle East, mightn't we? Because it's the western part of Asia. And that is becoming so clear in all the events that have been happening in the Ukraine and the results of those across the rest of Asia. So let me, in that kind of spirit, talk about some of the work that we've done in this area. I should say that a little bit about the work we do. Spinwatch has published quite a lot of different reports in this area broadly since about 2010 or 11, of work on neoconservative think tanks, on the Israel lobby, on Zionism, on Islamophobia and its spread across the European continent. And then more recently, a report we did on the UAE lobby, which we called the UAE Lobby Subverting British Democracy, which you can find on the Spinwatch website. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the findings of that research and then associated research in relation to the Saudis. But I should also say a little bit about Powerbase, which is our, as you said, our research database. And that is several thousand, I think 20,000 or something pages now, on individuals and organizations that are engaged in lobbying and Islamophobia and a whole range of other, I suppose you could call them nefarious activities. And there's a lot of the material that I will touch on tonight, which is dealt in with much greater depth in Powerbase. So feel free to delve into that. When I mention an organization, usually we'll have a page on that, and you can have a look at a lot further information and further resources. So just to point those to you. Okay, so I mean, I think that what I would say is a kind of big topic is that we need to start with Israel, really. I'm going to come to the Saudis and I'm going to come to the UAE, but in terms of this whole question of counter-extremism, yes, it started very early, post 9/11 in the UK specifically, and then spread to other European countries. Not all European countries have adopted these kinds of policies. Many of them have. France has, the Netherlands have. The EU as an institution did very early on in 2005. Spain has. Italy hasn't. So it's been patchy to some extent, but it has spread very widely across Europe and indeed beyond that. But let's think back to before 9/11. These ideas about the threat of terrorism and the ways in which they are associated with particular sorts of people, which you'll be unsurprised to learn I'm referring to Muslims, is something which goes back beyond 9/11. It didn't just start after 9/11. It wasn't just the British intelligence services who created their prevent policy in 2003, which started this process. There's an ideological lineage of these kinds of ideas. And they go back, most obviously to the conferences run by Benjamin Netanyahu back in the late 70s and early 80s, one in Jerusalem, and then one in the US in Washington in I think 82 or 3 or something. And a book came from the second conference called Terrorism, How the West Can Win. And it was at that conference, actually it was 1984, the conference, at that conference that the idea of Muslim terrorism was first dealt with in any significant way. It was mentioned in the 1979 conference, but by 84, Muslim terrorism, Islamic terrorism, they hadn't really properly invented the word Islamist yet as a kind of racist term for bad Muslims who think political thoughts. The idea of the association between Islam and terrorism is something which came very clearly from the Israelis and from Zionist intellectuals associated with them. In particular, there was a group of them called the Gang of Four Zionist intellectuals, not all of whom were Jewish, of course, but who were Zionists, who all of whom spoke at that conference, including most obviously the most famous of them, Bernard Lewis. And it was these guys, together with some other academics, some French academics, for example, who brought together the set of ideas which became the concept of Islamism. And that came out of their studies and their experience of Israel and Palestine, of the war in Afghanistan after '79, and indeed of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. And it was those sets of ideas which created this concept of the Islamist, which is the propensity of Muslim political actors to engage in violence. It didn't matter if they were Sunni or Shia, if they were Salafists, if they were Ikhwani, if they were associated with the Iranian Revolution, also a key source of information for these people. Well, it didn't matter. That was all subsumed under this concept of the Islamist. And we, of course, everyone's very, very familiar with that today. So much so that many people use it in a way where they think it's a neutral descriptive term rather than a wholly ideologically laden, indeed racist term. So I want to start off by saying something about that those ideas don't just come from Zionism or from Israel, but Zionism and Israel give them who brings the ideas to the business. It's not necessarily the Soviets who are the main problem, it's the Muslims. And the Muslims eventually, of course, a few years later, replace the communists as being the bête noire of the Western establishment. So, and if you look at the people who went to those conferences, the key neoconservative intellectuals were there from the US. Many of the people associated with the security state in the UK, with MI6, with right-wing think tanks, they were all there as well. And that's where this set of ideas comes from, I think it's fair to say. And that's really the prehistory of prevent, of countering violent extremism, etc. It's this particular and peculiar notion that the problem with Muslims is that they have this propensity to violence. They're not like you and me, non-Muslims, white people who, I don't know, have rational ideas or something and who can engage in democracy. These Muslims have these strange ideas, and that's where it comes from. And I think that we should think about this whole spread of counter-extremism in a longer time period than just the post 9/11 period. Okay, so that's my first few comments, I suppose. Now, of course, the whole question of the influence of the Zionist movement not just in relation to counterterrorism policy, but in relation to a whole series of other questions on foreign policy, defence policy, and indeed domestic policy. That's a very big question. We're not going to deal with that tonight, but I wanted to say that, you know, that the Zionists haven't gone away. Right? Now, you know that, right? I'm making an obvious point, but they are still there, of course. And their influence has remained on the thinking of many Western elites, especially, of course, neoconservatives who are, you know, in lockstep with Zionism. In fact, come out. The neoconservative movement in the US comes out to some extent or largely from the Zionist movement. The famous commentary, the Bible, the journal of the neoconservative movement, of course, published for a long time, not anymore, but for a long time by the American Jewish Committee, one of the key Zionist organizations in the US. So let's not forget the Zionist movement, and I'll come back to talking about them. But the reason we shouldn't forget them is not just because they still have an influence, but because there's maybe this is the time to mention this, there's an emerging alliance between the Zionists and their allies in West Asia. Okay, so I've said already that there's been an influence of the Zionist movement, the Zionist regime, on Western counterterrorism expertise, intelligence services, etc. In the contemporary period, we see the emergence of a new alliance between Israel and, in particular, the United Arab Emirates and the Saudis. And this is in the period since the Arab Spring. Okay, so it's a new thing, right? The Saudis weren't into this before then, and the UAE certainly weren't, but they are now. And these are regimes, I mean, and this may sound strange when we talk about the Saudis, but these are regimes which see political Islam as a threat. Okay, and the UAE lobby in particular has adopted and very enthusiastically counter violent extremism ideology. They have several think tanks which are funded by the state largely in the UAE, and have brought in Western terrorism experts and have integrated themselves into the European policy process. So there's an organization in Europe, which I'm sure you've already talked about previously, which I've just written a report on, called the Radicalization Awareness Network, which the UAE Centre Hidayah is involved in. And I think there's another UAE centre, the name of which escapes me, which is also involved there. So there's an integration of the UAE into that kind of Western nexus, and an alliance, a very specific alliance with Israel. So they pursue the same interests, lobbying interests as Israel in many regards. And this is, as I say, this is because of the Arab Spring. So the fear of the elites, of the dictator of the UAE, is that the Muslim Brotherhood associated social movement in the UAE could pose some kind of threat to his power. And of course, what they did in the Arab Spring process was they locked up 90 odd of them, didn't they? People who really hadn't any chance of creating any kind of revolution or even a reform process in the UAE, but nevertheless they targeted them, and they came to be obsessed with this idea that the Muslim Brotherhood was everywhere. It's not just, it wasn't Reds under the bed anymore, it was the Ikhwan under the bed. And this had became a key part of their foreign policy theory, okay? And so in the United Arab Emirates, what they did was that they started to export those ideas about the dangers of not just the Muslim Brotherhood, but other forms of political Islam. But particularly, they were worried about the Muslim Brotherhood, and they started to incorporate that into their foreign policy activities, including their lobbying in the UK, for example. So that it was I guess people know this, but it was the United Arab Emirates, the Emiratis, who insisted that the Cameron government should have a formal investigation of the Muslim Brotherhood. It wasn't coming from internal sources in the UK. It wasn't coming even from the Zionist movement in the UK. It was coming from the Emiratis, and they insisted on doing this. And their price, the price was, if you don't do it, we'll cancel British aerospace and British petroleum contracts worth millions and millions of pounds. It was a direct threat to the British government, and the British government acceded to that demand. In traditional international relations theory, such things do not happen. There is no such thing as the tail wagging the dog in relation to Israel, never mind in relation to a puny little state, oil rich, though it is, like the UAE. But that's what happened. They threatened them that they had to have an investigation, and they did an investigation. And they set this guy on the investigation, a guy called John Jenkins, who had previously been MI6's representative to the Syrian opposition, and had also previously been ambassador in many of the countries, I think in Jeddah, I think in Jerusalem. One can check where exactly he was the ambassador, but he was six. He was an MI6 officer, and he was put in to do this report. And the report was eventually rather sort of fudgily buried, and John Jenkins went off to work where he does now at the Policy Exchange, one of the preeminent neoconservative think tanks in this country. Of course, presumably still has those kinds of contacts with his former colleagues in MI6, which these people tend to do. So this one indication of the power that the UAE was able to leverage, and so what it was doing in this country was directly encouraging Islamophobia by encouraging this idea that the Muslim Brotherhood is some kind of conspiracy, global conspiracy against Western values, that it might be involved in terrorism, that it was itself a terrorist organization. They had declared that the Brotherhood in the UAE was a terrorist organization on the basis of nothing at all. And so, of course, they wanted the same in the UK. And of course, that's part of this debate about what, should the Muslim Brotherhood, this collection of interesting and not terribly well organized, pardon me for saying that to all my friends in the Muslim Brotherhood, who are not a threat of any sort to British democracy. And so that was part of this process. Now, of course, there's a similar thing with the Saudis. I mean, the tradition on thinking about Saudi influence in this country was that these were very bad fundamentalist Muslims. That's the word that they would use. I wouldn't use such a term. These were Islamists in the way I've been describing the use of that term. And there's even work done by neoconservative think tanks showing the way in which Saudi funds had been ploughed into Salafist mosques in this country. But after the Arab Spring, the Saudis start to make one or two steps towards the kind of approach to Islam, and indeed to political Islam, which the UAE was doing in lockstep with the Israelis. And the UAE is kind of the leading state of the two of them, here, who's led MBS in Saudi towards this kind of strategy. So, the idea that's put about in the liberal media that the Saudi regime is a kind of antediluvian theocratic regime couldn't be further from the truth. It's a regime which targets Muslim political activity and its lobbying activities, and is doing so in this country at present. And you can see much of its influence through, and this is well known, I guess, through its ownership and its shares in various newspapers, The Independent, the Evening Standard, etc., etc. And of course, most recently, the takeover of Newcastle Football Club. Now, this is not just a business decision, this is a political decision. The UAE, of course, also has its significant investments in British football for similar reasons. So, what we have is the UAE, the Saudis, and the Israelis working hand in glove together in pushing Islamophobia in this country, including the Saudis. There might sound strange to people, but that's what's happening. And of course, they have their own counter-extremism think tanks, and they have their famous de-radicalization program, which they try and hawk around other Western states to suggest that you can de-radicalize bad Muslims, make them into good Muslims, etc. So that's how that works. Now in practical terms, of course, that was done through a whole series of funding networks and alliances. So that the UAE, for example, funded a whole range of activities. They have a number of front groups in this country. They've put money towards journalists. Their ambassadors in the US, the UK, and other places to the UN have been involved in hiring lobbying firms, PR firms, and there's been many leaks. I think there's even a website called UAE Leaks of the emails of the ambassadors, in particular Ortega, showing the kind of activities they've got up to, including the direct funding of the famous Likudnik think tank in the US, the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, which the Ministry of Strategic Affairs in Israel boasts that it uses as an arm of foreign policy, but also it's funded by the UAE to do similar work. And there's a real indication of the unity of the strategy. It's just, these are the same people doing the same thing. So there's that. And then, of course, as people probably will know, the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies in the UK, which is, in the US, which of course, as I said, is the preeminent Likudnik think tank, which works as an arm of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Ministry of Strategic Affairs in Israel, also has a European branch. I don't know if people have come across it. It's called the European Foundation for Democracy. And it's funded directly by the FDD, i.e. by the Israelis and by the UAE and by a whole bunch of other traditional sources of funding of neocon and Likudnik think tanks in the UK and in the US, which is Zionist foundations as well as states. And there's a huge market in think tankery funded by these Zionist foundations. Millions and millions of dollars every year, both staying in the US and also traveling over the ocean to fund Israel's crimes settlements directly, the IDF, etc. Same in the UK. There's a big market in neoconservative and pro-Israel lobby groups in the UK, these are British Zionist foundations, although some money does come from America. Almost all of these organizations push Islamophobia or are run by Islamophobes. I mean, let me just pause for a second for some examples. So for example, just in recent weeks, there have been all sorts of stories, haven't there, about people at the top of the Board of Deputies of the Jewish National Fund who have expressed, I was going to say naked Islamophobic views, but it doesn't quite do justice to the depth of their racism. So, of course, there's an alliance here between Zionism and Islamophobia, and we see the UAE has played into that, and Saudis to some extent as well. And the European Foundation on Democracy, the point I wanted to make about that is that this is an organization which is also very well integrated into the European Union's policy circuits. So it's a key participant, indeed helps to run the Radicalization Awareness Network, which operates across the whole European Union, and until Brexit, of course, operated in the UK too. This is a very strongly Zionist and neocon think tank helping to run European Union counterterrorism policy. And there's another organization which is also involved there very strongly, perhaps even more strongly than the European Foundation for Democracy, and that is an organization called the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, a key Zionist think tank in this country, which also, of course, employs quite a number of Muslims who are into counter-extremism and who follow the Quillian path into essentially arguing for the state to spy on Muslims, in the way that they do. So I want to say then that these connections that there are, these kind of odd little organizations like Hidayah in the UAE or the Saudis think tanks, and some of the Israeli-based think tanks, the Institute for National Security Studies or the the private university in Israel, which is now called the Uriel Reichman University, used to be called the Interdisciplinary Center, the only private university in Israel where 20% of places are reserved for elite IDF or Israeli spooks. I mean, these are key nodes in the knowledge production network, which helps to produce ideas about Muslims, which are then transmitted to this country and other places. I mean, there's a whole range of these organizations. They seem, well, if you go on the website, the INSS or the IDC or indeed Hidayah, I mean, you think, well, this is just some kind of right-wing terror expert people, but these are actually, central nodes in the network of expertise on terrorism and on Islam, which help to push government policy in a more and more anti-Muslim direction. So in a way, talking about West Asia and about particular countries and how they operate, well, we can do that. These are part of a much wider network, as I'm sure you've already been discussing when you were discussing the spread across Europe, a much wider network of interlocking organizations. So the EFD, for example, I mentioned, European Foundation of Democracy, is based in Brussels, the ISD, the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, based in the UK, INSS and the Roy Institute, tons of them in Israel, but they're all also engaged in activities across the continent and in influencing policy in this country and in many other countries. Maybe I should leave it there for just now as a kind of broad introduction to the kind of themes that I would talk about.
Thank you very much, Professor David. So we're going to, I'm going to put forward some questions that have come in, but just a reminder to the audience that if you're finding events like these beneficial, then please do consider joining MPACUK and the team as a volunteer. There's a link in the chat, and there should be a link below. So I'm just going to ask a couple of naive questions to, take advantage of the fact of your expertise. So like in the UK, we've been seeing the government coming close to crossing a sort of a red line of public tolerance when it comes to securitization and the centralization of power. And we're seeing pushback against things like the existing prevent duty, the policing bill, and so on. And if the UAE and the Saudi continue with their securitization, would they run into a red line of their own public's tolerance, do you think? What are your thoughts on that?
I think that's unlikely in both the Saudi case and in the case of the UAE. It's also unlikely in the case of Israel, in the sense of the Israeli public, meaning the public who are given the full rights of Israeli citizenship, i.e., as we all know, Israel is not a state of all its citizens, far less of the people who have been additionally occupied since 1967. So there's not really much chance of that. But the chance of pushback, I mean, there's, as you say, there's pushback in this country on prevent. There's, there is a mounting pushback on Islamophobia more generally. I would see even in France, where the right are tearing themselves apart in the current presidential election with the National Front candidate Le Pen and the, what do we call him, Israel's candidate Eric Zemmour, the Pied Noir from Algeria, who is taking votes from the far right there. So there's that kind of pushback. But I would want to mention also the geopolitics of this, right? So something I haven't mentioned so far, which I should perhaps have mentioned, I definitely should have mentioned. I mean, I guess everyone will have seen this in the press. Maybe it's not been in the Western press very much, but the attacks that Ansar Allah have launched in the last week on the Saudis, indeed the direct hit on the Aramco refinery, the fire that the Saudis couldn't put out, the attacks on water facilities, etc. The running sore of Yemen is something which does pose a problem for them. So, of course, as we know, the Saudis are involved in that in the least. The UAE have also been involved in sending death squads in there and all sorts of activities. And that's something which is an ongoing sore in the world. But let's think of it in wider terms, in terms of West Asia. I mean, the Ansar Allah are part of the much wider, what should we call this, group of entities called the axis of resistance. And that is an axis which, in this country, in polite, white society, we don't really mention such things, but that the axis of resistance is an actually existing thing. And we saw that especially last May in the attack on Gaza, and in the attacks and the resistance in Sheikh Jarrah and in Silwan, and indeed in other places, even in 48 Israel, where settlers were, I think for the first time, run out of town by the Palestinian population of, for example, in Lid. So there's a kind of thing going on here, which is that the axis of resistance becoming an actual thing, connecting Gaza, the West Bank, Israel 48, Iran, Iraq, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Syria, and indeed Ansar Allah in Yemen is an extraordinary, has an extraordinary level of coordination now, which I think people weren't aware of about a year ago. And that has the possibility of pushing back seriously against Western interests, and indeed Saudi and UAE interests in the region. But maybe if I can put a bigger focus on that, which is I don't know how much people are seeing this or aware of this. I mean, I'm not sure how much of this has been coming through into the Western media. But if one looks at what's happening in the Ukraine, without going into the rights and wrongs of this specific part of the conflict, the result of this is being that on the one hand, there is a kind of the attempt by the West to sanction Russia, which has been widely seen across the rest of the world as being something which is damaging to the West. If you cut off Russian access to SWIFT payments, or you refuse to pay in rubles for gas, you provoke the Russians, or provoke is the wrong word, you make the Russians go and do their own thing. Now, in the last few days, the Russians are just inking deals with the Indians on alternative payments outside the Western system. That the Germans are saying, we're not going to pay rubles for gas. It's a breach of contract, as if sanctions weren't a breach of contract, as if the Russians are going to say, oh well, that's fair enough. You could have them in dollars then. They're not going to do it. So what we're seeing in these kind of, giving you a couple of examples, there's lots more examples. What we're seeing is a reorientation, a realignment of the world. And even if you look at, I mean, I'm thinking of the example, I mean, there's tons of stuff on this now available, but even if you look at the work, the article recently by a guy called Alistair Crook, who has been very strongly involved in what I would probably call spookery in Israel-Palestine, even engaging with Hamas as well as with Fatah. Now, this is a guy who's ex-MI6, and and probably represents the left face of MI6, if that's a meaningful expression. And he's saying, look, the West's never been so united in this case against the Russians, but how lonely is the West? The whole world is changing. Now, in the context of that changing world, wherever that goes, and it's going to go somewhere very interesting. The Chinese, the Russians, the Indians, the Iranians coming on board. Do the Venezuelans join in? You have a very, very interesting realignment in the world, and that will inevitably have results in West Asia, and the possibility of pushback by the axis of resistance against the Saudis, against the UAE, against Israel, in terms of the governance in Iraq too. And you can already see the way in which this realignment is taking place. The Chinese now saying, oh no, Taiwan isn't anything like Ukraine. Taiwan is an integral part of Chinese territory, and nobody will be telling us what to do about it. That's a newly assertive tone from the Chinese. And it looks to me like we're going to enter in a period where it's going to be much more difficult for the West to take the kinds of punitive action that it's historically, in the whole 9/11, post 9/11 period, historically done, which is we'll just invade, we'll kill lots of people, thousands, millions of people, civilians, and we will bring democracy to those countries. And oh, wait, that didn't work. Didn't work in Afghanistan, didn't work in Iraq, will not work in relation to their, I mean, imagine if it did work in the Ukraine and we had Nazis in charge. I mean, just truly extraordinary. So anyhow, I mean, what we're seeing is a realignment here, and that will inevitably have implications for West Asia and for the whole question of countering violent extremism. So we might see a lot more pushback on that as a result of this realignment, because the Western countries will not be able to resist in the way in which they once were able to resist. And the sanctions will be shown, I think, to have been a disastrous move from the point of view of the self-interest of Western states.
Thank you for that very broad brush. I'm just going to bring it back to the Middle East. We've got a question here from one of our audience. What can Muslims and activists do to counter what both Saudi and the UAE are doing? So, coming off the back of the previous question, in terms of the local public tolerance or intolerance of what their own governments are doing, as states, they feel quite secure in how they're running against public opinion about Israel and about securitization and so on. So as outsiders, for those of us who are outside the region and outside those countries, is there anything that we can do to end this this budding relationship between Saudi and the UAE and Israel?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I sort of outlined, I didn't go into the full breadth of these, the involvement of the UAE and the Saudis in this country, or indeed of the Israelis, which we know a lot more about and which is much more extensive than either of the other two countries. But, in this country, they have lots of activities, and these activities should be stopped. I mean, the first step to stopping them is for people to know about them. So we need to be exposing the deal over Newcastle, or the role of the UAE in Man City, as well as their role in communities, the extent to which they're funding activities in the communities which are inimical to the interests of ordinary Muslims. And these can be exposed, and people who are engaged in collaborating with these organizations and with this money will start to think twice about whether they should do that. They'll get upset, first of all, of course. They'll say, oh, we didn't have anything to do with that. We didn't know about that. That wasn't true. And then, the more that there is outrage about these things in the community, the more that people will stop doing that. I mean, just to give some examples, the counter-extremism apparatus is run in this country by British intelligence. It's run by an organization called the Homeland Security Group, which is part of the Home Office, which is one of the 7 British intelligence agencies operating in this country. Now, that should have no place in any community organization or communities. Now, but of course, it does have a big place. It has a place in the sense of identify, prevent officers who are, I would say, assets is too weak a word, operatives of British intelligence. But it also has a big role in ways that people don't understand and don't know, in funding and directing down to the tightest editorial control the activities of apparent civil society groups. I mean, and there are hundreds of these funded by and directed by the state. Building a Safer Britain Together. All those organizations are effectively funded by the British state. There are many more. I mean, just to list some. I mean, something like Inspire, or the New Horizons of British Islam, or GIMAS, or the Active Change Foundation. I mean, tons of these organizations which are covertly funded through RICU, the Research Information Communications Unit of the Home Office, which is part of this intelligence agency, the Homeland Security Group. All these organizations should be told to divest or to abolish themselves, because these are agents, assets of British intelligence, and they should have no role in Muslim communities, because they're spying on and subverting Muslim communities. That's one thing, right? And the second thing, of course, is that there are large numbers. When I say large numbers, I mean hundreds of Zionist organizations in this country, who are dedicated to obfuscating the human rights abuses, ethnic cleansing, and settler colonialism of the Zionist entity. Okay, hundreds of these organizations. Now, when I say that, people look at me and they, well, is there really hundreds? Yes, there are. I mean, there are hundreds and hundreds there are hundreds and hundreds of these organizations. There are a number of hundreds which are formal members of the Zionist movement, by which I mean they have a formal affiliation to the World Zionist Organization. Right? That's hundreds of organizations, probably 250. Haven't been able to count them all yet, there's so many. And then on top of that, of course, there are the Friends of Israel groups. They're not formally Zionist, but they're informally Zionist, part of the movement. There are hundreds of charities devoted to Zionist education, propaganda, taking kids as young as 3 into education activities and taking older kids over to Israel to make them into propagandists for Zionism. All of these organizations, and there are hundreds of these, are funded, for example, by a whole range of charities. Now, there are at least 50 charities in this country who are directly giving to the settlements. Now, all of these organizations should forthwith be shut down, but that's the ones given to the settlements. But all of the Zionist organizations, every single one, should either be de-Zionized and made to be representative of the Jews, not of Zionists, or they should be deconstructed, taken apart, cease to exist. These are racist organizations, and they should have no place in a civilized society. So that's 2 things, right? Once we've done all that, there will be other things to do. But let's start with some of those things. People can do that in their locality. Who are these organizations? Who are the people involved? What are they doing in this? I mean, I'm aware, for example, that there are journalists and community activists in this country who work directly for the Saudis who in this country. That should stop. I mean, I don't want to use this platform to name some of those. I could, but there are lots of these organizations. There are a number of Muslim organizations who work closely with NATO, with the Atlantic Council. I mean, all of that should stop. That is antithetical to normative Muslim practice, and should be stopped forthwith. So there's a lot of things that people can do. These organizations are here amongst us. They walk amongst us, these people. And that can all be brought to much greater public attention with the object of eliminating these organizations.
In terms of bringing these organizations to attention, would your sites, Powerbase.info and spinwatch.org, be a good starting point to begin looking at, if there's a list of organizations there? Or
Sure, there is. I mean, there are hundreds of organizations on there. I mean, we have a page on the British Zionist movement, which has several hundred organizations on it, but it's not nearly complete. I mean, I don't think anyone's ever done the work of actually counting up all these organizations. I'm trying to do it just now. And then many of these organizations that are engaged with RICU, with British intelligence, these Muslim community organizations, quite a lot of them are on there. And there are leaked documents on there which prove their involvement and prove the way in which they have involved themselves with RICU and have allowed themselves to have their editorial lines determined at every stage of the production process of their publicity by British intelligence officials.
And I'm going to bring the event to a close with one more question. Again, just to pick your brain some more as we've got the opportunity. So UAE and the Saudi regimes, they must be aware that Zionism and Islamophobia are intrinsically linked. And despite the short-term pragmatism of working together, there's always going to be a long-term ideological divide. So what is the long-term inevitability of this, closer union between these countries? Is there going to be an ideological realignment from the Saudis, or are they just making a clash inevitable? I know, predictions are never a great thing to talk about, but what are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, I don't think that there's a divide. I think that they are ideologically Islamophobic, both the Saudi regime and the UAE. I mean, the UAE for the reasons that they think that they're threatened by the Muslim Brotherhood, and that translates to them into a hatred of all things political Islam. So yeah, I don't think there is a division there. I think they have this unity. I think that the realignment in West Asia might make things different. I mean, if you look, I mean, in the Ukraine, the Israelis have supplied weapons to Nazis in the Ukraine. They have IDF people have been training the Nazis over there, but at the same time, the Israeli Prime Minister has adopted a somewhat diffident line, more diffident than the US and the UK have in relation to the conflict. And indeed, also the Saudis and the UAE have done the same thing, even more diffident than the Zionists have. And that's an interesting thing, isn't it? The question of what happens in any realignment that comes. And of course, the whole question of oil and dollar markets and ruble markets will play out very interestingly in that question. So there's a possibility there because of that we will see a realignment such that the Saudis and the UAE will play the smarter game from their own perspective in terms of any realignment. But I don't think there's any division between them on the question of Islamophobia.
That is a fascinating answer. I'm going to end the live stream there. So thank you for your time, Professor David.